The freedom of the open road, escape from the everyday, and throw in a little rebellious spirit. I mean, that's what motorcycles are all about, right? Well, according to author, historian, and professor Dr. Wendy Pojmann, that idea may only really exist in the US, whereas in Italy, motorcycles are looked at more as part of everyday life. In her book, Connected by the Street, The Myths and Realities of Motorcycles in the USA and Italy, Wendy breaks down the pretty striking difference between how motorcycles are perceived in the US culture versus Italian culture, whether you look at racing, manufacturers, or even motorcycle clubs. The impetus for Wendy's research stems from her passion for everything Italian, from Ducatis and Vespas to espresso, and combines it with her personal experiences from the surprising number of reactions of both Italians and Americans when they learn that she rides a motorcycle. Although I guess you won't find a huge crossover of college professors and motorcycle riders. What's really fascinating, though, about Wendy's book is that it takes a lot of things that us motorcycles may already know, but it frames it in an academic sense, complete with scientific research and historical context. And really, you may not look at Italian motorcycles the same way again. This is Dr. Wendy Pojmann. I'm your host, Mark Long, and you're listening to Driven to Ride. All right, Dr. Wendy Pojmann, you are on Driven to Ride. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited. I know that you are the first historian, I believe, on the show, and I want to say you're the first doctor on the show.
Okay.
So
I guess that's right away my claim to fame.
Yeah, I guess I spoiled it. I apologize, but there's a lot more to you than that too. So we've got a lot to talk about and a lot to work with. But excited to have you on the show. Got a lot of great stuff to talk about with you. But I want to start, with you, with giving you the floor. What is your claim to fame? What would maybe most people know you for, in your own words?
Honestly, I think that in the upstate Capital District here in New York, that probably two of my motorcycles have a claim to fame more than I do. One is my 1974 Honda CL200 Scrambler. And I've actually had people literally follow me to gas stations to ask about the bike. And the other is my recent acquisition known as the Bumblebee, which is a Ducati Street Fighter 848. So they probably are better known even than I am. But I will say probably I'm known for being the history professor who rides a motorcycle to campus.
That's very cool. That's very cool. And I mean, I got to say you are selling yourself short a little bit because you are, a motorcycle historian, and in the context of Italy and the U.S. And you could probably say your field of study and expertise a lot better than me. So can you kind of frame it for us?
Yeah, of course. So I am a historian of modern European history with an emphasis on contemporary Italy. And I've published several books that deal with contemporary Italian history, such as during the Cold War, one about migration to Italy. The book before, Connected by the Street, is Espresso, The Art and Soul of Italy. So I have a long career writing about all kinds of subjects related to modern European history and Italy. But for about the past 6 years, I decided to start writing about my other big passion, which is motorcycling. And that led me to start working as a journalist and developing a body of work there. And then I felt I had a number of things to say specifically about the differences between American and Italian motorcycle cultures. And that led me to my book.
Yeah, and it was a great read. I was able to actually finish it yesterday. It's an interesting. And let me get it out of the way. It's the myths and realities, or I'm sorry, Connected by the Street: The Myths and Realities of Motorcycles in the USA and Italy. And there it is. Thank you for showing it. It's a very cool book for multiple reasons. One, that it's in both Italian and English, which I was kind of surprised by when I first opened it up, because the English pages are all on the left side, and then the Italian pages are all on the right side. And I just, it's like when you open up a book for the first time, you kind of maybe just open up to the middle and see what's in there. And I just immediately go to the right page. I'm like, wait a minute. I don't understand this. Did I get a book all in Italian? Then I looked to the left. I'm like, okay, no, it's in English. And then I got it or whatever. But it was very interesting to kind of open up the book for the first time.
Well, I decided to do that in part because I have a number of motorcyclist friends in Italy, and they had pointed out that sometimes it's difficult for them to read my work
Okay.
because they have to either use some kind of online translator or whatever and put things into it. So I had an audience in mind both in the US and Italy because of that.
Yeah, which is very cool. And, I've read that you do split your time between Italy and the US. So I wanted to kind of start with, where did your love of Italy come from?
Well, since you are in Chicagoland there, I attended Loyola University of Chicago as an undergraduate. And part of the reason I chose that school was because they had a Rome Center program, which is now called the John Felice Rome Center. And I had decided early on that I wanted to spend my junior year abroad in Rome, which I did. So I studied Italian. I went to Italy. I fell in love with Italy, being there. And so I thought about what could I possibly do with my life that might lead me back to Italy and to Rome.
Nice. So, really, it's kind of almost sounds like motorcycles. When you first experience it for the first time, you kind of just know that it's going to be a part of your life forever.
Maybe. In my case, maybe not, because I was always attracted to motorcycles. I mean, I was one of those kids who'd be like, oh, motorcycle. But I came from a family that was very much of the motorcycles are dangerous mindset.
Oh, really?
So I was discouraged from riding motorcycles. And my parents were kind of clear that they didn't even really necessarily want me around people who rode motorcycles. So of
Oh,
course,
geez. Okay.
being a rebellious teenager, so of course I had boyfriends with motorcycles and rode on back, often without really knowing any better too. No gear, no helmet, that kind of thing. So my now husband, who is Italian,
hmm
uh, when we first started dating, I rode on the back of this MBK, this like terrible French scooter that would lose pieces all over the cobblestones in Rome. And I thought it was fantastic, riding around in Rome on a scooter. I'm like, what else could you possibly want? And it's so Roman holiday.
Right.
And when we got married, we were still living in Italy, and we actually bought a motorcycle with the money that we received as wedding presents.
Nice. So how did you go kind of from the transition from riding as a pillion to riding your own motorcycle?
A few years later, I lived in Rome for 4 years, actually, and then we came to the U.S. and settled in the Kansas City area because I had family there.
hmm
And for various reasons, we didn't end up getting a motorcycle there. But when we came to upstate New York for my job at Siena, we would start going around on weekends and thought the roads really looked kind of fantastic around here for riding a motorcycle. So we bought actually a Suzuki V-Strom 1000, and I was
hmm
still riding on back. At some point, I actually fell asleep on the back, and I was getting a little bit bored. We took some nice trips. It was very pretty around here, but I kind of, I don't know, just lost interest somehow. And
hmm
then, oddly enough, one day I was going into my ballet class, and one of my ballet friends came in with a helmet. And I was like, oh, interesting. So after class, I'm like, what are you riding? So she took me out and she had a Royal Enfield 500. And I'm like, oh, that's
hmm
cool. And then another ballet friend came to class on, it was a V Star. I don't
Oh,
remember
a
what it was. I
second
think it
one.
was,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah. I was like, wow, well, if they can do it, why can't I do it? Like maybe that would kind of renew my interest. So I signed
Sure.
up for that MSF, like half day introduction to the motorcycle course. And basically you just kind of sit on it and they explain how it works and all that. And I think we pretty much got into first gear and went across the parking lot. That was about the most extensive part of it. But I'm like, yeah, I can do this. Why not?
Yeah,
So
for
then,
sure.
I signed up for the full course. I had to wait a few months because they were pretty booked up. And then, at the end of the class, I passed because I'm a professor, so I'm a good student.
Right.
And I got my license, and then I got my first motorcycle, which is Little Blue that I referred to, the CL 200.
Nice. Yeah. Kind of getting into piloting a motorcycle as an adult and as an academic, do you think that maybe you had some advantages at taking the class and getting your license, maybe, as opposed to maybe doing it when you were, maybe a teenager or a bit younger?
I think that starting as an adult, maybe you have a little more trepidation, a little more common sense,
Sure.
and you don't maybe have, though, I think when you start as a kid, kind of like with dance or playing an instrument or something, you have that muscle memory that I think accompanies you through life. So as an adult, you have to, learn the skills and practice. And and again, I think that um, being someone who likes to study and learn and has a
Hmm.
curiosity about things, I still try to take classes every season, whether it's a non-sport bike training day or another MSF class. I signed up for Ride Like a Pro for this summer, so I
Nice.
try to keep training because I think that that's important.
Yeah, agreed. I actually, in the book, I saw a photo of somebody who has recently been on the show, Ken Condon. So I'm guessing you said non-sport bike training day. So I'm guessing you took his class.
I did take Ken's class, and I hope to do another one this summer.
Yeah. Can we get a quick review? How did he do?
Oh, it's fantastic. I mean, I love the going back and forth between the classroom instruction and then getting a chance to implement that actually on the track. And I like the morning and the afternoon. They had follow the leader um,
Nice.
sessions, so you got to kind of each one got to follow the instructor and learn the lines. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a great
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah, Ken was a great guest on the show a while back, and him and I had a great conversation. So it was kind of fun when I was like, I saw the photo and saw Ken Condon in the caption, and it was kind of cool there. So
Yeah, and I do have friends who've also taken one-on-one instruction from him for street riding. So
nice.
anything you can do to improve your skills, and again, as I said, as an adult coming into it later, I think that's important.
Yeah, well, and going back to what you said, kind of when you started with your interest in motorcycles before you even got on one, that your parents didn't have any interest in you, A, being on a motorcycle, or B, being around people on a motorcycle. That must have been where the seed was planted to kind of write this book, because you go over the misconceptions that the mainstream media and that I think the general public at large kind of have about not only the dangers of motorcycling, but also the I guess overall perception of motorcyclists in general. I have to imagine that those experiences when you were younger probably were part of the impetus to write the book.
Absolutely, and I think they've continued around people that I know who don't ride or know much about motorcycling. So I often do get this kind of thing. Oh, well, that's weird. You don't look like somebody who would ride a motorcycle. Even strangers, I got off a bike once. I was meeting a colleague, a friend of mine for lunch, and I got off my
Mhm.
bike, took off my helmet, and there was a woman sitting on a bench. She's like, "Oh, I didn't expect a pretty lady to be getting off that motorcycle." I was like, I don't know what to say to that.
Thanks,
So
I guess. Yeah.
yeah, thank you. But yeah, I do think that there are all kinds of perceptions about outlaw motorcycle gangs and now urban hooligans that tend to get a lot of media spotlight, and that's what the general public is exposed to. Whereas, of course, motorcyclists, we know that there's a lot more to it, and there are so many different subcultures and styles of riding and people who ride. But unfortunately, not much of that seems to filter into mainstream media.
Yeah, yeah, which is kind of getting into in the overall of your book is that I never really thought about approaching or looking at motorcycle perceptions and stereotypes and um, just kind of rider culture in general, looking at it through the academic lens with cited sources and studies and all of the academic research that goes into the book, because you do present it in a very academic way, which is very cool. I don't think anybody's really ever done that with the motorcycling culture, almost like a sociological perspective of things. When going kind of through it, was there anything that surprised you, or was it a lot of like validation of what you already knew?
I think a little of both. And I tend to approach my research through things that I do care about and
Hmm.
through personal experience. So with this book, I wanted it to be based on things that I've experienced myself, but I didn't
Hmm.
want to leave it as completely autobiographical. And
Sure.
as a historian, I'm always looking for how is the individual experience informed by the broader culture? And we can't really say things happen historically unless it's happening to a lot of people. So you need that kind of sense of collective identity, not just individual identity. And that's when I started to dig deeper. Like,
Mm.
well, this thing happened to me, or this is what I've observed, but is there any real evidence of that beyond what I'm saying? And so that, led me to read a lot of books about different kinds of motorcycles, different
Mm.
approaches to motorcycling, and to look, at statistics and kind of piece all of that together.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, from me, it's very well done, very well researched, very well organized. I really enjoyed reading it, and you'll have to forgive me because I am bouncing around because I do have a latte
Mm.
with me in honor of Italy and talking about Italian motorcycle culture. So I'm a little over caffeinated, so forgive me on that. But let's back up a little bit. Where did the idea for the book come from, and can you give us kind of a brief overview of the book itself? I know I've kind of gone into the details a little bit, but let's zoom out a little.
Yes, the book comes from, again, my kind of the questions people ask me in the US versus Italy when they find out that I ride.
Hmm.
And I was curious to understand how and why those questions are so different. And so overall, I do see the US as being a little more of a motorcycle culture that's separated from the mainstream, as I was saying, whereas in Italy, motorcycling is very much integrated into daily life. I don't really think I know any Italians who've never been on two wheels.
Wow.
It's just a part of their existence. And in a way, um, the motorcycle coffee thing is actually how I started writing about motorcycling to begin with.
Hmm.
And I was kind of curious about, maybe around 2018, 2019, seeing all these motorcycle coffee shops popping up in the
Right. Yeah.
US. And I was like, well, why? What's going on? So, um, I had just done work. I was finishing a book about espresso in Italy, but noticing the role of specialty coffee culture in the US. And so you start to see this convergence of specialty coffee, this kind of cool barista figure,
Hmm.
and then the motorcycle aspect of that. And again, that led me to asking more questions and also trying to develop, I think, a writing style that is accessible to everybody. I didn't want this to be a book just for academics.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is very approachable. It is written in a straightforward way. It's not like you're reading a dense research paper or anything like that. Although you do have a lot of, like I said, sources cited, and you have your research and your bibliography. So I mean that in a good way. It's very very accessible, and it was a pleasure to read. Um,
Well, I appreciate that. So, yeah, in terms of a breakdown of the book, the first two chapters really look at the development of motorcycle history in the US and Italy.
mhm,
And I do use World War II really as the dividing point during which the two cultures start to diverge quite a bit.
mhm.
Because before that, they're very similar. And I can expand on that in a second if you like.
Yeah,
Uh,
please.
yeah, after the war, then they change. Then in the third chapter, I look at primarily American motorcycles in Italy and Italian motorcycles in the US, and why there's that kind of cross cultural fertilization. Like, why do Italians love Harley Davidson? And why do Americans love Ducati and Moto Guzzi or what have you? So
Yeah.
that's chapter 3. Then chapter 4 is my motorcycles are dangerous chapter, where I look at statistics, but then also go into things like gear and training and so on. But then I also um, there discuss mental health and well-being and why motorcycling is good for us, and then also all the good things that motorcyclists do, such as charitable rides and different organizations. And then the last chapter, I look especially at social media, motorcycle tourism, and some recent developments in both countries in terms of the industry.
Very cool. Yeah, it's I enjoyed the Italian history of motorcycling. I think because I just didn't know about it. Another thing that I didn't really think about is that Italians love Harley Davidsons, and there is a huge subculture of Harley owners over in Italy. So, but yeah, let's expand a little bit. In kind of broad strokes, the how the histories of motorcycling between the two countries kind of were parallel and then diverged, as you mentioned.
The early history of motorcycling, there are a number of similarities because that's really the age of innovation. So you have, the first manufacturers starting out, and there's, of course, a strong tie between bicycling to
Hmm.
creating a motor and putting it on a bicycle frame and then actually producing motorcycles. One thing actually I was a little surprised to learn more about. So, for instance, here in upstate New York, Glenn Curtis, the famous aviator, who was also um, a bicycle racer and motorcycle manufacturer. Um, when I was looking at some of the engines he created in the Glenn Curtis Museum, which is out in Hammondsport, New York, in the Finger Lakes,
Hmm.
I was really intrigued by the fact that you have like these actually like huge displacement engines with very low horsepower.
Sure.
And when Glenn Curtis set the land speed record, it took him several miles to slow down
Yeah.
at the end. Again, because you have kind of rudimentary brakes and all of that. So whether it's Indian Harley Davidson, Glenn Curtis, Excelsior Henderson in the U.S., and then in Italy you have the equivalent types of manufacturers with Bianchi. Of course, they're known for making bicycles still today.
Hmm.
Bianchi, um, Gilera, which Giuseppe Gilera actually changed his name to Gilera later, which is how we think of it. Della Ferrara, Frera. So there are all kinds of manufacturers all doing very similar things, of course, benefiting from this new wave of industrial growth and manufacturing in both countries. So they are able to sort of fit into that moment. And then many of them also went into aviation or were born from aviation. So Moto Guzzi, for instance, came out of an Air Force squadron from World War I where they were friends. And other companies, even MV Augusta Piaggio, they were also in aviation
Hmm.
before they started manufacturing motorcycles. So we have very similar things happening in both countries. And I will also mention that women were there all along as well.
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick, one of my favorite kind of sidebar stories that you had about was the founding of Benelli. Can you share that story real quick?
Yeah, Teresa Benelli, after her husband passed, she wanted to find an activity for her sons. And yeah, so actually, um, they started producing engines and then later motorcycles. But she led up that company. But you have really interesting women racing already in the teens. There's maybe even kind of a golden age of women in motorcycling in the 1930s and 40s. So before World War II.
Hmm. Yeah, it was cool that you highlighted a lot of contributions of women in the motorcycle industry and motorcycle racing and motorcycle firsts for that matter as well. As a historian, I'm sure you're unfortunately all too familiar with how history has a tendency to gloss over the accomplishments of women over the course of history. So I was happy to see that you included a lot of that.
Yeah, and I didn't actually want to write a book about women motorcyclists.
Sure. Yeah.
I wanted a book about the history of motorcycling that also was like, yeah, there were women there too.
Hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I kind of threw that in there because I thought that was a cool part of it. I mean, you have women crossing the country literally, and then petitioning the military to become messengers and to deliver
Mhm.
important messages and do their part for the war. I mean, it was an active role, and I thought it was something cool, and that I hadn't heard about, and I don't think people have heard enough about. So I appreciated you including it in there. But we left off. I think we were like in the mid 30s there. I think we were coming up onto the World War II aspect of motorcycle history.
Right. So in World War One, the Italians did import American motorcycles to help with the war effort. So
Mm,
there were both Indian and Harley Davidson were in the European theater. A lot of people, do discuss that Indian has problems after World War II, but even after World War One, they had trouble kind of getting back into commercial production, which they
mm,
accomplished again. In World War II, there were actually more Harleys than Indians in the European theater.
Mm-hmm.
And after the war, though, is when I think we start to see a much larger divergence between the two countries. So in the US, there's, of course, an immediate economic boom, which is also, we see the Highway Act. And so we have the construction of interstate highways, bigger roads, better roads, also a shift from urban to suburban life. And of course, the dominance of the automobile.
Right. Yeah. Car culture.
But at that time, I think that, so Indian kind of fades from the spotlight by 1953, despite their attempts, and they actually had Jane Russell, for instance, doing advertising for Indian. And so they made a concerted effort, but didn't work out. Financial problems mostly. But those roads in those situations favored the, larger, comfortable motorcycles for covering long distance.
Mm-hmm.
You also have the return of veterans who are looking for an outlet. There was not a lot of, mental health awareness of PTSD and so on.
Right.
And a lot of veterans just knew they felt better when they hopped on a motorcycle. And so that too encourages the development of motorcycling in a particular way. And Italy, of course, was heavily bombed during World War II, which the US was not. So there was a lot of infrastructure that needed to be rebuilt.
Mm-hmm.
And an economic boom in Italy doesn't really start until the end of the 1950s. So in the interim, they're really trying to reconstruct, get people back to work, get people back to school.
Sure.
There's not a lot of money. The Marshall Plan starts, helping a little bit with some aid. But a lot of manufacturers, including Ducati, which had been around making transistors and video projectors and all kinds of electronics before the war, at the end of their factory was bombed in Bologna. And in the rebuilding, they actually decided to get into making engines. So they started with, again, the Cucciolo small engine on a bicycle frame, and then eventually got into making motorcycles. So, and Piaggio with the Vespa. So they recognize the need for smaller, affordable motorcycles that anyone can ride to get to school and work as the country rebuilt. And so you don't really see the popularity of the automobile until the end of the 1950s.
Gotcha. Yeah. So it's almost like, it sounds like one of the reasons that motorcycles kind of became a mainstream part of kind of Italian culture was out of necessity, really. Nobody could afford a motorcycle.
Absolutely.
There wasn't a place to manufacture a motorcycle. They kind of had to start from scratch. And small motorcycles were kind of all there was.
Right. And then we also see the popularity, especially from around 1953 to 1957, of actual road races on Italian streets.
Okay, yeah.
So like the Isle of Man TT, there was actually what was called the Mussolini Cup, which becomes the Milano Taranto, and the Moto Giro d'Italia, which had started in the 19-teens.
Mm-hmm.
They also help spread the popularity of motorcycles. And a lot of the manufacturers were racing bikes that were not special. They weren't super bikes yet. They were normal production motorcycles that were maybe beefed up a little bit here and there. But it was important for people to sort of see them actually literally going by in towns and cities, and also see that if it broke down, you could fix it. And that was a really pretty good showroom for a lot of the manufacturers. Again, like Gilera, Ducati, again, starts to get into it, MV Agusta, and really kind of highlights what the motorcycles could do.
Yeah, I mean, if you see it literally going down your street and, you can go to the dealership and pick one up, that's the exact same thing. And you can maybe modify it a little bit just like somebody else has. That's, way more approachable than a $1 million MotoGP bike or $2 million MotoGP bike, however expensive they are now. I can't remember, but it definitely makes it a lot more approachable. And you see it in sports and in traditional sports, I guess you could say too, other than racing, where, people play soccer and wear their favorite, athlete's jersey or whatever, or, same thing with American football and baseball. It's kind of an emulation of what you see in the professional athletic world.
The other thing, though, that happens in Italy that's different, even in terms of, I think, how motorcycle cultures are today, is that the Italians develop a graduated licensing system.
Okay.
So you can't drive a car until you're 18.
Okay.
But you can get a permit or a license, really, to ride a 50cc scooter when you're 14. Sure. And they don't use school buses there either. So if you're going to get to school in particular areas, or maybe you don't want to take the city bus or what have you, it made the scooter market really large for the Italians. And so you have a graduated system where you go from, I think it's a 50 to a 125 to a 200, and you can't get a 500cc or larger bike until you're 18. And that, too, I think, encourages younger people to work their way up and to develop skills. And I think a lot of times, Italians are pretty good riders because of that. Whereas like when I was in my MSF class, of course, we're standing around the parking lot talking to each other between drills and, right. What kind of bike are you going to get? Or what are you thinking of? And I was surprised, actually, that quite a few of them already had a motorcycle. They just were not riding with a license yet. And a lot of them were, looking at pretty big bikes as first bikes. And I don't know, I guess maybe because of, again, being around my husband who started on smaller motorcycles, and even a lot of my, say, older motorcycle friends, a lot of them too, who started riding maybe in the 70s or 80s, often started on smaller displacement bikes. And so they encouraged me, well, maybe don't go bigger than a 500 for your first motorcycle. And in fact, I did start on the 200. But I think that too favored in Italy more attention to those smaller motorcycles, which, remain in favor even today.
Interesting. Yeah. I never really thought about it that way, where it's a more gradual kind of progression in Italy, where you can start really young and get the basics down, especially with a 50cc scooter, where you don't have to worry necessarily about a clutch and a transmission and all that. You just have to worry about being on two wheels and navigating the roadways on two wheels. Meanwhile, here in the U.S., you can just go to a dealership and buy a bike. My dad actually used to work for a couple of dealerships in the Chicagoland area, and I remember I was young, I was like a teenager, but I was floored when he came home and was like, yeah, somebody came again and they didn't have a license, but we can still sell him a motorcycle. And he wanted to ride at home and there's nothing we can do. And he, bought like a 1000cc Super Sport and flipped it in the parking lot. And it went right off the dealership floor to the service department. And I was just like, I still am floored that that's the way it works in the US, but that's just kind of what we've inherited, I guess,
Right. And that's not to say that the Italians don't have big motorcycles, because they do. And
yeah,
the BMW GS, I guess now the 1300, they still are regularly the best selling motorcycles in Italy, and they are large and they are expensive and, they are popular. For a few years, it was bumped. Actually, the GS was bumped out of first place by a Benelli adventure bike called the TRK 500. Which was about half the cost of the GS.
Sure.
And was, considered a pretty efficient machine. But, so I think that there's a range of representation of sizes and styles of motorcycles in Italy that we don't see as much of in the US, especially. We don't see that many scooters.
Sure. Yeah. And it makes sense that maybe those bigger bikes are probably easier to handle for Italians, because like you said, they started on scooters. And so if you start on a small displacement motorcycle, or a scooter for that matter, and learn the basics of how to operate a motorized two-wheel vehicle, and how to navigate it in both the dense city traffic and then the little outer, more out of the way rural traffic, you just have the skill set, you have the experience to be able to jump on a bigger bike. So,
and another advantage, I think, I often will say that I actually feel more comfortable riding in traffic in Italy, but I also enjoy, where I live in upstate New York, these rural roads where you never see any cars. That's also lovely. But the Italians in their cars too, they're just so used to having two wheels among them that
Sure.
it's not a surprise. Like they're aware that you're there. There's a kind of choreography that develops in traffic, and not we talk about lane splitting or lane filtering. You
Mm-hmm.
actually fill spaces as you're going through traffic. There
Oh,
aren't
okay.
necessarily clear lanes all the time. The times are kind of all over the place. So
Sure.
you work your way through and you get to the front of the cars and leave with the other two-wheeled vehicles at stoplights. And you need to know the size of your motorcycle. And I think the car drivers are aware of the size of their vehicles. And so sometimes you have a car that's inches away from you and nobody's freaking out about that. It's
Interesting.
just what people are used to. Just
Yeah.
got to make sure your handlebars fit through when you're trying to pass through. So
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like since like it's in the mainstream culture, they look out for it more rather than in the U.S. It's almost the exception rather than the rule.
right, and it depends on, of course, where you are. But
Mm-hmm. Was that kind of a shock to you first riding in Italy, figuring out and navigating the rules that work with them, or was it like, oh my God, thank God that I can do lane filtering and that people pay attention, or was it easier?
I think that since I had been riding on back for a long time, I was
Mm,
accustomed to how it works. So when I started riding myself, it was less daunting.
sure.
I also think that I also ride a dirt bike, and I think that actually riding single track through the woods is really good practice for riding in traffic in Italy.
That's a great point. Yeah, yeah, because the trees aren't going anywhere, and there's
No,
some
trees don't
real
move, but you got to be aware of how close they are to you.
yeah, there's some really narrow passageways when you do some off road riding. So that's pretty cool. There's a pro tip if you ever want to go to ride in Italy, start practicing on the dirt
Yep,
roads in the
exactly.
woods. Well, you mentioned that there are no shortage or is no shortage of large motorcycles in Italy. Again, it surprised me that included in the ranks of large motorcycles are Harley Davidsons, and there's a lot of pride and this healthy subculture of American motorcycles in Italy. Can you talk about a little bit of where that came from? I know we touched on it a little bit, but and maybe touch on why it's still so healthy today, what it represents, what an American motorcycle represents to an Italian rider.
Yes, I have a number of Italian friends who love Harley Davidson, completely loyal to the brand, and are constantly singing the praises of their Harleys and why they ride them. As I mentioned, there were some leftover Harleys after World War II,
Hmm.
and then there was even this famous film, um, Un Americano a Roma, in which the lead character embraces everything American, chewing gum, Coca-Cola, rock and roll, blue jeans, and he rides a Harley. And what's interesting from that film is the mispronunciation, though, of Harley Davidson as Harley Davidson with
Oh,
an
really?
N, because that character says it that way, and he also says Kansas City, puts an extra N in Kansas City, uh, and so even Italians who haven't seen that movie still sometimes use that pronunciation, even Harley riders, which is
Wow.
kind of
Okay.
funny.
Yeah.
But anyway, Harley Davidson didn't really, though, have any dealerships until the early 1980s, when actually it was a man named Carlo Talamo who was from Rome but moved up to Milan. Um,
Hmm.
Basically, he got involved in a Cagiva dealership where they were importing some Harleys, but he wanted to actually have a full-fledged Harley Davidson dealership. So he opened a shop in Milan called Numero Uno, which took a while to get off the ground, because again, it wasn't really necessarily that well known to Italians.
Hmm.
But he was a masterful advertiser. Um, he did a wonderful job with ads where he was always sitting on a Harley, and then what would be considered like a lot of copy today, describes the emotions he feels on a Harley,
Okay. Yeah.
and this particular connection to the heritage, the history, the values of freedom and the open road, and all of those kinds of myths that I mentioned in the book
Right.
associated with Harley Davidson. And I think today a lot of Harley riders in Italy do see the brand as a status symbol.
Okay.
because they are expensive,
Hmm.
especially in a market where you have a lot of less expensive options available, even, for cruisers or whatever style you like.
Hmm.
So it's a bit of a status symbol. And I think that Italians do see the Harley as this representation of a kind of romantic idea they have about America. And I think that those are certain kinds of values. I don't think it matters what government is in place, or who's the president at the time. I think what they care about are these like deeper things like history, community, freedom,
Sure.
independence, all of those kinds of things that continue to, inform how they feel about their machines. And there's a really funny character, this guy, Gianluca, who he's been working for Harley for decades
Hmm.
in Rome. Gianluca, one of my favorite things he said to me when I interviewed him was, well, I love it when I'm at a stoplight and everybody's looking at me on my Harley and I don't look at anybody else. And he's like, and that's kind of what it's all about. And actually, he and his friends, they shipped their Harleys from Italy to the US and did, the coast to coast, New
Oh,
York to
wow. Okay.
California.
Yeah.
A lot of Italians want to come and do Route 66 on a
Hmm.
Harley. So that's all part of that, say,
Yeah.
collective imagination of Harley Davidson.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Yeah, Indian instead's not as well known. Because again, they faded from the marketplace.
Hmm.
I did interview some members of an Indian motorcycle club, and it is growing. They have more dealerships now,
Sure.
and they do have some like regional meetups, European meetups. So, but not nearly the same impact as Harley.
Yeah. I mean, Harley Davidson, however you think of them, they are kind of the personification or the manifestation of kind of all the mythos of America. Like you said, the freedom of the open road and the, way to be independent and the, lone motorcyclist and just going out for a ride kind of thing. It's there's really nobody that beats that. And so it's funny that, and fascinating that people outside of America want that because we just take it for granted, I think.
One thing that surprised me, another one of my friends who is committed to Harley Davidson. Well, I asked him, I'm like, well, have you ever ridden an Italian motorcycle?
Mm.
I'm like, you're Italian and you're in the land of, again, Ducati, Moto Guzzi, Aprilia.
Yeah. Some serious
He's like,
brands.
no. He's like, actually, no. He's like, I've never ridden an Italian motorcycle. I was like, okay. I thought that was curious, but
Yeah.
I guess I have American friends who haven't ridden American motorcycles either. But
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, just like you mentioned, though, Italian or motorcycling is such a part of the Italian culture that you'd think that that they would at least once, ride a Ducati or an MV Agusta or anything like that. So let's flip it though, because you brought up some other fascinating points about how Americans perceive Italian motorcycles, and to me it seemed like you didn't really find that same manifestation of the romance of Italy in Italian motorcycles when Americans think of it.
I think rather than specific values like freedom, like we've talked about with American motorcycles, I think Americans I talk to who ride Italian motorcycles do value things that I think are an intrinsic part of Italian culture, but maybe aren't expressed that way. So they
Okay.
tend to emphasize the design, the aesthetics. Italian motorcycles are pretty. And they're lovely.
They
Um,
are. They are.
and the engineering, so they care about performance and tend to emphasize, I guess, a kind of Italian character that comes through their motorcycles. So whether
Hmm.
you might consider that quirkiness or what have you, Italian motorcycles have a kind of personality
Sure.
that maybe you find, which I have Ducatis, I also have Hondas, and so I started on a Honda. I have had a Suzuki and so on, and um, there is something just a little bit different, a little special about Italian machines that you do notice if you ride a lot of different motorcycles.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think now they're finally getting over um, the now misconception that they're unreliable. It's just like the same thing with Triumph and British bikes, where it was like, well, they're not going to work. They're unreliable. They're going to break down or whatever. I don't think that's the case anymore, really, for Triumph or for Ducati or any other Italian motorcycle for that matter.
No, I think, modern machines are modern. I think that a lot of the problems, especially, I don't know, probably in the 90s, even still,
Mhm.
a lot of ideas about Ducatis or other Italian, or as you say, British bikes being unreliable has passed. And I think I even saw, I don't know, maybe a Consumer Reports list a couple years back
Mhm.
where Ducati had moved ahead of BMW in reliability for
Oh, wow.
motorcycles. Um, BMW people don't want to hear that, of course, but
I was going to say much,
um,
much to the joy of the Germans. Yeah.
but yeah, I do think they're reliable. I do, and I shouldn't even get started on a Desmo service and that kind of thing. But um, so I do think that sometimes still scares some people away, maybe
Mm,
from Ducati in particular because of the desmodromic valve system.
sure.
But again, I'm on like I have a lot of Ducatis and I've not had those problems, knock on wood. But I think what you get out of those machines is special.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Ryan F9 from Fort Nine
Mhm.
and those guys up in Canada. And they rode across the world in however many days it was, and they did it on multistradas. I mean, and
Yeah, they have
um,
the Multistrada V4, and actually one of my good friends who's in our kind of riding group, where
mhm,
we are not a motorcycle brand or country exclusive at all. We're a
right.
very informal riding group. But
Yeah.
one of our friends has a Multistrada V4, which is what they used for that. And yeah, he enjoys it immensely. And again, he's had all kinds of bikes, BMWs,
Sure.
Japanese bikes. Yeah.
So one of the other things, I mean, talking about being in the DNA and kind of going hand in hand with motorcycling is coffee, and in Italy espresso and all that. And like you mentioned at the top, you've written a book kind of on espresso. Um, how does from writing the two books and doing all this research on these two different books, what makes motorcycles and coffee go hand in hand? Because that seems to be a thing that is worldwide almost.
Well, again, in Italy, espresso is integrated into daily life, as are
Yeah,
motorcycles. And so actually you don't really see like special motorcycle coffee shops there because they don't really need them. I mean,
it just
you're out
is.
for yeah, I mean, you're just out for a ride and you stop at an espresso bar and you get your espresso. I mean, that's just part of the routine, whether it's a gas station or a restaurant
Hmm.
or an actual what they call a bar, but bars serve, often even a light lunch and all kinds of other things.
Sure.
Um, and actually, that's one nice thing about Italy too. You can like climb to the top of a mountain, and there'll be espresso at the top, which is fantastic.
No way. Convenient.
um,
Yeah.
I think that there's an interesting overlap because espresso is also part of the early 20th century, like motorcycles are. And
Okay.
there's a similar development and innovation and aesthetics and machines. I think that there is important overlap among all of those things. The US has a different kind of coffee culture, which developed with filter coffee.
Sure.
And espresso came in later, in the 80s mostly. I think part of the American shift too comes possibly a little bit from hipster culture. And I think there's also a bit of a reaction against the old school riding a motorcycle to a bar,
Mm,
drinking
sure.
beer, and then
Right.
riding to the next bar, those kinds of events that sometimes, have been for charities, but you ride from bar to bar and you drink beer and then you keep riding and drink more beer.
Yeah.
And I think
Right.
that maybe some younger people, I mean, you do see studies that younger people are drinking less alcohol than they used to.
Hmm.
And I think that translates also into motorcycle culture because, I think people are more aware of the risks associated with drinking and riding. And so maybe, being caffeinated is a better choice.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I think it was fascinating that it seems like for as long as I've been a rider that like motorcycles and some sort of caffeine go hand in hand. I've never really associated it as going to like from bar to bar, like you mentioned. I think that is kind of more of an old school thing. And you go into it a little bit in the book with the dangers of motorcycling, just how much of a factor that alcohol is in crashes and fatalities, which is unfortunate. And we don't have to get into it too much if you don't want to, but I did think it was a fascinating kind of thing to consider, like you mentioned.
Well, one thing my husband pointed out. So when I go to ride in Italy, I just get an international driver's permit, which basically you just go down to AAA. They translate your license into the language of the country you're going to. You get a photo, blah, blah. And they're valid for a year. So that's what I use when I ride there. I don't have an Italian driver's license.
Okay.
But my husband, who does still have his, but he also does the international license. But my husband mentioned that when he took, because he's taken the motorcycle licensing exam in both Italy and the US.
Okay.
In Italy, he said that on the exam, and I have seen some examples, there are exactly 0 questions about alcohol. But there are questions about motorcycle maintenance and even machinery.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
And in the US, first of all, our exam is much shorter. I think, 30 questions or something. I think the Italian license was like 100 questions. And he pointed out that probably 5 out of the 30 questions were about alcohol. And when I took the MSF class, we went through this whole ladder of risk section, and we're essentially told that, it takes about an hour for the average person to process 1 drink. So if you're going to ride, have a beer, you should wait at least an hour before you get back on your motorcycle. I will admit, I will have a glass of wine at a restaurant with dinner and then drive home in a car, but I would never do that on a motorcycle.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's just 2 different worlds almost, really. It's a strange juxtaposition.
But again, from all the studies that I've seen, the greatest risks are drinking, excessive speed, and inexperience. And excessive speed, you can calm down when you're riding. You cannot drink or do drugs when you're riding.
Right.
Experience, you just have to earn that. You just have to get out there and ride and practice and do what you can to improve your skills.
Yeah.
And, I think that most accidents occur within the first 2 to 3 years of riding, which would be totally true in my case, for instance. Again, nothing major ever happened to me, knock on wood again, thankfully, but, little spills that came from mostly inexperience.
Right.
That you learn. And I think that's another thing I have to say too. I think with starting as an adult, and maybe even not always as an adult, but I think there's this kind of tipping point that you reach when you start riding. And for me, it was, because again, upstate New York, the season is short. I got my license. It was the end of the summer. I didn't have a lot of time before winter kicked in. So it was probably like sort of halfway through my first real season of riding. I remember, and I got my Suzuki Gladius after the little CL, which was also a really great bike, very forgiving. And I think you could ride it as a beginner, as an advanced rider, and still enjoy it. But I do remember getting back from a ride one afternoon with my husband, and instead of thinking, oh God, thank God we made it home, I was like, oh my God, that was so much fun. Let's go back out there.
Right.
And I think that for some riders, and I will say I've seen this again among adults, often among women, like they don't quite flip that switch from anxiety from riding to joy from riding. And I think that's really important. And sometimes I wonder too, when I look at ads for motorcycles online, which I'm always looking at used motorcycles online, I have to admit, I think I see a lot of low mileage bikes out there.
Interesting.
Because people give up. Like they don't.
Oh, sure.
So it might have sometimes I think, yes, okay, I bought this bike and it turns out I don't have the time, or, and I do hear people like, oh, well, just had a baby. My wife wants me to stop riding. So I think, there are those reasons, but I think there are people who maybe don't quite feel that joy.
They don't reach that.
Again,
they don't cross that threshold of.
Yeah.
maybe I don't want to call it mastery, but competence and comfort on the
Competence.
bike. Yeah.
And there was actually a researcher, I don't remember what her field is exactly, but she wrote an article called "Oh Shit Moments,"
Yeah.
and how that too builds confidence, and overcoming a challenging moment on your motorcycle and coming out of it unscathed
Sure. Yeah.
can contribute to that becoming then a positive experience. And I know the couple little spills I took, like I immediately, as they say, get back on the horse, and I did.
Hmm.
Yeah, either immediately, or one case I couldn't ride the bike home, but I rode the next day, a different bike,
Oh, nice. Yeah.
because I just gotta get back on there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thank you for writing the book and kind of collating all this information and providing a really great history of motorcycles, both in America and Italy, and showcasing kind of like you said, the cross cultural moments in the book, and just in helping to kind of show that the perception of motorcycles in the U.S. is not necessarily what's real, isn't necessarily what's shown in mainstream media or in the general public. And so, with that, I wanted to ask, what can kind of your average motorcyclist do to maybe help change that perception in the U.S.?
Just be good people out on a motorcycle. And one thing I love about motorcycle culture is that I have talked to so many people I never would have spoken with if we hadn't all been on motorcycles.
Mm.
And it's not uncommon. Actually, one of our friends is kind of known for, like, he has this little business card and gives it out to everybody on a motorcycle we encounter, and get in touch. And in the meantime, check out my website of all the motorcycles I've ever owned, because you have nothing
Wow.
else to do.
Nice. Pretty cool, actually. Yeah.
So I love that. But I've also, I'm actually, last September, I went to the Women's International Motorcycle Association rally in Maine.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, my husband and another friend of ours rode with me out there. And then I went to the camp with all the women. And then we rode back together. And we stopped, I don't remember, somewhere in New Hampshire at a gas station. And there were two little girls with their mom, and they were pointing at me when I was putting in gas. And I went to buy some coffee, of course. And the little girl came up to me, and she grabbed her mom, and she's like, "I want to talk to the lady on the motorcycle. I want to talk to the lady on the motorcycle." And she came up, and it was just kind of this nice moment. And I think that just kind of being out there, being nice to people, talking about motorcycling, anything you can do to demystify the motorcycle. And I think that's actually one benefit of some of the motorcycle coffee shops. There's a popular one near where I live called Moto Coffee Machine in Hudson, New York. And I have friends who go there who aren't motorcyclists, but it's great because there's motorcycles in the shop, there's gear, there's people talking about bikes. And I think that helps to demystify motorcycling and motorcyclists and makes them more approachable. So any of these kinds of spaces, or the moto social events, do that too. They're always like, everyone's welcome. So wherever you can, bring people in and show them, motorcyclists are normal people, and motorcyclists, are not that scary, and look at these beautiful works of art, and aren't they interesting? I think it all helps.
I like that term, demystifying. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Is anything we can do to demystify what a motorcyclist is, because there is no one motorcyclist. There are all different kinds. So I think that's really cool. So where can everybody pick up the book, learn more about you, and actually read some more of your writing, because you've been featured on a couple of great websites as well.
All right. So the book is available primarily through Parigi Books, which is parigibooks.com. And there you can purchase a signed copy. There are some copies at Blip Coffee Roasters in Kansas City. If you happen to be in Kansas City, and speaking of great motorcycle coffee shops, you can stop in at Blip. They have some copies there. And Motorcyclopedia Museum in Newburgh, New York, which features one of the best collections of Indians in the country. So if you're in Newburgh, you can pick one up there. But yeah, the best place is parigibooks.com. And then I have been writing for the Vidagent, thevidagent.com, which is run by Paul Dorleon, who's a very well-known journalist and motorcycle historian. And I've also been writing for Common Tread through Revzilla for their website. So if you go to the revzilla.com, you can look at the Common Tread link. You can find some of my work there.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you again, Wendy. And we appreciate the time. And we'll link all that stuff in the show notes in the description as well. So if you want to check out more of Wendy's writing, which I highly suggest you do that as well. So,
and if you have a more academic interest, the International Journal of Motorcycle Studies, they did publish one of my articles about motorcycle racing in Italy, which is a bit longer. And they have a conference coming up actually in July where I will be presenting some new work there too.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you for all the work you've done on behalf of the motorcycling world. And it's been a pleasure. And I hope we could talk again soon.
Thank you, Mark. And I appreciate all you do as well with your podcast to bring motorcycling to more people.
Thanks. I do what I can. So, but yeah, we'll talk soon, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Driven to Ride. Interact with us and check out full unedited conversations, photos, interviews, video interviews, plus other goodies on YouTube or Instagram at Driven to Ride Podcast. Or you can check us out at driventoridepodcast.com. And make sure you leave us a rating and review from wherever you get your podcasts too. If you have an idea for an episode or a guest, or you want to invite us out on an adventure, email us hello@driventoridepodcast.com. Driven to Ride is wholly owned by Flint Rock LLC, made possible with help from Matthew Miles, and written, hosted, and produced by me, Mark Long. We'll see you out there.